My name is Perry Buffy. That's B as in boy, U, double F as in Frank, I-E. I have to spell my name out loud over the phone a lot. Everyone wants to make it Buffy with a Y at the end, or Bussy with S's instead of S. The last name sometimes confuses people, and absolutely induces questions from people from time to time, usually about its origin. As in Buffy, what kind of a name is that? And we've all been asked where we're from, or where our family is from. When I was in high school, I took German language classes, as I'm sure a lot of you did. And as was common, the teacher asked what nationality we considered ourselves to be. German, I told the teacher. Your last name Buffy doesn't sound German. The German must be on your mother's side, said the teacher. Nope, I replied, Scotch-Irish on that side. Well, the teacher said, go home and ask your folks what nationality you are. So I came home and I asked my dad where we Buffys really came from. I knew Dad was born in Canada and I was born in Minnesota, but for some reason when people asked, what are you? They weren't looking for an answer like Canadian or American or even Canadian-American. I needed to dig deeper. So Dad, what are we really? I asked. Well, he answered, we're actually Austrian, but the Austrians speak German. And then he told me, before that, the Buffys came from Alsace-Lorraine, in France, but back then it was German. I agree that Buffy doesn't sound German. I think the name's French, he said. But don't mention that to the Canadian cousins, he told me. It makes them mad. Then my dad made things more confusing by telling me that the town his grandpa's family came from, Reichau, was in Poland. So I was just confused. Then my mom told me that the area where she grew up in Northern California had lots of Italians. And there was a family there named Buffy, but it was spelled B-U-F-F-I. Maybe we were Italian. There were some B-U-F-F-I Buffy families in Canada. I found out they weren't Italian, but they too were this odd German, Austrian, Polish mixture. We're not related to them, I was told when I asked about it. But, to make matters more confusing, I met some relatives who spelled the name B-U-F-F-Y. And some Kurt's cousins once went to Reichau, that town in Poland where the family came from. They had pictures of graves from the cemetery there, and some graves were spelled B-U-F-F-Y, and some with B-U-F-F-I. So clearly the actual way we spell the last name does not define our relatedness. And the more I looked over the years, the more I got to wondering, who are these Buffys with their funny last names spelled 3 different ways, and with their Italian, French, German, Austrian, Polish, Canadian, American heritage? So, about 15 years ago, I started to educate myself about this family, and now I'm going to share some of what I learned with you. Now, just in case you're thinking this is going to be a dry presentation on a family tree, let me assure you, this isn't the case. First of all, our family tree is much, much larger than most of us imagine. You just get lost in all the detail. Secondly, up until the last several generations, the families had the tradition of using just a few first names. So all of the Peter, Katrina, Johann, and Annas start to run together. I've tried to talk about this with people, and I know how well it goes. So rather than try to keep you all interested in the sort of detail that we history geeks are into, I'd like to answer the 2 most frequently asked questions that I get. I am sure you get some of the same questioning, or have asked yourself, Buffy, what kind of a name is that? And what does that name mean? What nationality are we? The common thread to answering all of these questions has to do with human migration. I think that when we hear this, we think about it in more recent terms, such as our ancestors' immigration to North America. but migrations have occurred throughout human history, beginning with the movements of the first human groups from their origins in East Africa to their current location in the world. Migration is the movement of people from one place in the world to another for the purpose of taking up permanent or semi-permanent residence. So to answer the question, where do we come from? Let's start at the beginning of what we know about our family. Let's start with our specific Buffy genes. National Geographic has a project called the Genographic Project. Several years ago, I participated in the project and provided a tissue sample for DNA testing. My DNA testing results would be the same for any males dating back many generations. Therefore, we do not all need to repeat the testing. We would all get the same result for the Buffy lineage. The result of the testing indicated that we Buffys are part of a group of humans with DNA subtype identified as haplogroup R1b M343. M343 is the number I'd like you to remember for the next couple of minutes. DNA studies suggest that all humans today descend from a group of African ancestors who, about 60,000 years ago, began a remarkable journey. The starting point for everyone was the same: the Horn of Africa, the proverbial Garden of Eden. This map does not show all human migration, just that of the R1b haplogroup and its subgroups, including the M343 group we are a part of. You can see that our ancestors moved from Africa some 60,000 years ago, into the Middle East, then Eurasia, and then some 30,000 years ago became some of the first Europeans. Here is where subtype M343 ended, Northern Europe, with further migrations into Spain, England, and Italy. This is where the genetic evidence of our ancestral trail ends. The incursion into Italy is what interests us next, however, because while the genetic evidence for the Buffy migration ends in Northern Europe, the linguistic evidence for the origins of the Buffy family pick up in Italy. Like I said, while our immigrant ancestors to the United States and Canada were German speakers, the name did not sound German. It really sounds more Italian than anything. And thanks to the internet, I can randomly look up an Italian phone book and see that in this particular phone book for this region, there are 92 people with a Buffy surname. Some of you who are using Facebook have Buffy friends from Italy, like Barbara Buffy from Tuscany. This Facebook page gives us a clue as to what the name means in Italian. This page translates as fun and funny animals. Buffy means funny. Here's another Facebook page. This one's for an entertainer in Italy, the translation for which is funny name. And there are tons of examples of this, so we see that Buffy is an Italian surname which means funny. This is where we get a word for a kind of clown, a buffoon, which has its origins in Italian. But if you look closely, you'll see that it's derived from the Latin word for toad, which is itself an onomatopoeia for a sound a toad makes. Buffo, buffo, buffo. So I guess that toads are kind of funny, but they're also quite stubborn. Does that sound like a family trait to anyone, perchance? Perhaps our earliest documentation of a Buffy family dates to the 14th century in Urbino, Italy. An aristocratic Buffy family supported the building of the Church of St. Francis in Urbino, and thus an altar and a crypt named for the Buffy family remains there to this day. In 1489, this painting was composed by Giovanni Santi for a wealthy Buffy family in Urbino and adorned the church in the altar of St. Francis there. As was common in that day, the Buffy family is portrayed in the lower right corner. The original painting is now in the Urbino National Gallery. This is perhaps the first time we have seen a picture of someone with the Buffy surname. I guess the genes run strong in this family, even 413 years later. So linguistically, we know the Buffy name is Italian, and we still find a lot of Buffys in the northern parts of Italy as well as in Switzerland. Here is a graphic representation of where Buffy families are located in Italy today. Note that a lot still live around Urbino, which is located where the 15 is on the map on the Adriatic coast, and also in Tuscany on the Mediterranean side. near the 25 on the map. You can see that the families are predominantly in the north of the country, especially near the border with Switzerland. Not too long ago, one of the Italian-speaking states in Switzerland had a governor named Giuseppe Buffy. I really just wanted to tell you that to pick a locale from which to make my next point. If you were to drive today from Giuseppe Buffy's home on the Italian-Swiss border to the small German town of Schweinschied, where our earliest documented ancestor Peter Buffy was born, it would be a 567-kilometer trip and take 6.5 hours. And for we Americans, 567 kilometers equals 352 miles. Let's put this into context. It's 734 kilometers from Minneapolis to Winnipeg, or 456 miles. In other words, the distance between the area where Buffys are concentrated and the German locale of our earliest documented ancestor Peter is 25% shorter than the distance between most of us. And I bring this up to tell you that it is not too much of a stretch of the imagination to picture the migration of Peter's father or forefathers given the proper circumstances. And those circumstances did exist at the time. Peter Buffy, having been born in 1610 in Schweinschied, Germany, with an Italian last name, means that at some point, either his father or one of his grandfathers made the relatively short trip from northern Italy or Switzerland to the Rhineland part of Germany, and successfully integrated himself into German society. You see a quote here I took from a Wikipedia page about Italians in Germany, and it says that during the Renaissance, roughly the 14th to the 17th century, many Italians migrated to Germany. In those days, neither Germany nor Italy were the countries that we know them as today, but rather a part of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was a varying complex of lands that existed from 962 to 1806 in Central Europe. While the boundaries of the empire changed during this nearly 1,000-year existence, you can see that shortly before Peter Buffy's birth, the Holy Roman Empire centered on what would become the nation of Germany, and encompassed all or parts of many neighboring countries. Here we see how the Holy Roman Empire looked a few decades prior to Peter's birth. This ancient map of the Rhineland Palatinate shows you that the territory included parts of the modern French regions of Alsace and Lorraine. Schweinschied is in the Rhineland Palatinate. The little town where Peter Buffy was born in 1610 had already been around for about 300 years, and remains today a small town of about 240 residents. Schweinschied was built near the site of a Roman room from perhaps the 3rd century AD. Here's a Google Maps aerial view of Schweinschied as it currently looks. This is the Lutheran Church in Schweinschied. It was built in 1825 and replaced the church that Peter was baptized in, but it did hold the church records from that previous church, including those that mention Peter. So at this point in time, the only information we have to offer about Peter is what we know from the church book. And the sum of that knowledge is that Peter Buffy's date of birth is listed as 1610. He married a woman named Elizabeth, and they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son named Johann. Perhaps the little family looked something like the family in this painting. I was surprised to find out that one of Peter's grandsons immigrated to Pennsylvania from Schweinschied in 1748 and bought land there from Thomas and Richard Penn, who were sons of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. Now, this man's son fought in the Revolutionary War, and he is buried in this church cemetery there in Pennsylvania. Well, the American colonies were not the only place that Peter and Elizabeth's grandchildren and great-grandchildren were immigrating to. There were colonies to the east as well, and it was to Galicia in the east that our Buffy ancestors immigrated. Let me take a couple of minutes and explain Galicia. In the early 1770s, the Holy Roman Empire was in its last years of existence. It ceased to exist in 1806. The Austrians, who ruled the empire at this time, had a large nation beyond the borders of the empire, but Austria was facing economic and political pressure from the kingdoms of France, Prussia, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. Hoping to hold on to power and avoid war with Russia, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, who was also the ruler of Austria, at the urging of the French — Joseph's sister was Marie Antoinette entered into an agreement with both Prussia and Russia, dividing Poland up amongst themselves. So in 1772, Austria gained these Polish lands, circled in red. The western half of this land is in the modern-day country of Poland, and the eastern half is in the modern-day country of the Ukraine. These lands were named the Kingdom of Galicia, but they really were part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy from 1772 to 1918. The political autonomy of Galicia was modest, despite its designation as a kingdom. As the Holy Roman Empire ended in 1806, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, known as Austria, had itself become a world power. The Austrians wanted to modernize the Polish lands, and so they established a system of German colonies in Galicia. Talented German craftsmen, artisans, and tradesmen were invited to relocate to Poland. They would be given land, houses, stables, cattle, and agricultural implements free of charge, and for 10 years they would be exempt from taxes. Farmers and their older male children would be exempt from military service. Freedom of religion allowed for Protestants to freely practice their faith. All of this was granted in exchange for agreeing to live in the newly created German towns, with the hope that German industry would spread to the Poles. The Austrians wanted German farmers from the Rhineland-Palatinate to settle these colonies for a particular reason. You see, unlike in most of Europe, where land and farms were handed down to just the eldest children, in the Palatine the folks had the habit of equally dividing their farms and estates amongst their children. Thus, farms had become progressively smaller with each passing generation. To make up for this, the farmers in the Palatine had all become tradesmen, craftsmen, or artisans. Well, around 1780, two Buffy brothers lived with their families, one in Schweinschied and the other a couple of kilometers away in the neighboring town of Hopstetten, in the Rhineland-Palatinate, near Alsace-Lorraine, in what is now modern-day Germany. And according to information from the German Library in Frankfurt, on April 7, 1783, 7 persons with the name of Buffy departed Schweinschied, headed for Galicia. Their profession was written down as farmers and weavers. Now family lore has it that 2 brothers left for Reichau in Galicia, and perhaps it was the 2 brothers Johann Jacob and Johann Wilhelm and their families that left that April day in 1783. While we don't know exactly who made up the party on this excursion, the church records in Reichau indicate that there would have been many other migrations of brothers and cousins and families with the name Buffy as well. The wagons they traveled in would have looked something like what we see in these illustrations. And I imagine the departure looked something like this. And again, they were going here, in Galicia. And as we zoom in on the map, and where the red dot is, we see it's the little town of Reichau they were headed for. If you look closely at the map, you'll see lots of towns with Polish or Ukrainian names, but there are also a bunch of towns with German names, Deutsch-Smolen, Waldorf, Hartfeld, and the like. Looking at a modern-day Google map of the trek, it looks like this: 1,436 kilometers, or 836 miles, by horse-drawn wagon cart. Here's an actual modern-day picture of the town where all of the Buffys went to in Poland. Back then, it was a German settlement named Reichau. Now it is a Polish town named Podlesy. Here's a street view of the former Reichau, now Podlesy, that I found on the internet. The homes are ancient, but they do all have their satellite dishes. Our cousins Paul and Wally Kurtz provided these pictures of the town from their trip there quite a few years ago already. Comparing it to the previous pictures, nothing has changed in the last couple decades, except the satellite dishes. Again, the town is now called Podlesy. Here is the Reichau Church, where births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths were recorded. The church books provided the details that we have used to build the history of the family, but they are confusing and incomplete, so we sometimes must fill in gaps in knowledge. The church is still there, but now it's a Catholic church. Wally and Paul said that this was identified to them as the Buffy house in Reichau by the villagers. The records do reveal that there were two Buffy houses in Reichau, house number 3 and house number 16. I am not sure which one this is. Here is the back of that ancestral Buffy home. Buffys over the years did not all stay in Reichau, but all of their ancestors started out in that village. Over the years, sons and daughters left for other nearby villages, like this one, Bosnia Dolna. There were quite a few nearby German settlements that Buffys moved to, but the church at Reichau always remained their home church and was where the important events in their life were documented. The Protestant cemetery with the Buffy graves is there in Podlesi, but it is overgrown and in disrepair. Probably because there aren't any Buffys left living in Podlesi, the former Reichau, nor are there any Buffys left in any of the former Galicia for that matter. 100 years after they arrived in Galicia, Germans began to leave. Beginning in the 1880s, a mass immigration of the Galician peasantry occurred. The immigration started as a seasonal one to Imperial Germany, which was newly unified and economically dynamic, and then later became a transatlantic one, with large-scale immigration to the United States and Canada. This was part of the Great Migration of Eastern European immigrants that started out as a trickle in the 1870s and turned into a mass movement in the 1880s that continued to swell until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. More than 4 million East Europeans journeyed between 1880 and 1914, of which a total of 700,000 people were Galicians. These are advertisements from those days advertising to take East Europeans to North America. Now all of my Buffy relatives came across in this way, as did yours. For instance, my great-grandmother Barbara Schick Buffy and her children came across the Atlantic and passed through Ellis Island in May of 1899 on this ship, the Fürst Bismarck. The trip would have begun with travel to Hamburg, 1,200 kilometers or 700 miles away. From the Ellis Island archives, I retrieved the ship's manifest with Barbara and her children's names written on lines 26 through 29. They sailed from Hamburg, Germany on the 17th of May, 1899, and arrived many days later in New York City. In this close-up of the ship's manifest, you can see that Barbara Buffy, age 32, is listed as a wife. She accompanies her children Johann Buffy, age 10, Caroline Buffy, age 3, and Marichen, age 2. Marichen is the nickname for a child named Anna Marie. Their nationality is listed as Austrian, but as we know, they are from Galicia, which you now know was, in 1899, a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The town they are from is listed as Nowe Siolo, Polish for New Hamlet, or New Town. This is just a little town up the road from Reichau, and Nowe Siolo is still there in Poland to this day, just down the road from Podlesi. You can see this close-up that the family is going to New York to be with Barbara's husband, Wilhelm Buffy. This is only one example of the hundreds and thousands of times this process repeated itself over the next decades, as this great migration happened in all of our families. I'm only giving you one example from my own lineage. We see here the family reunited, sometime shortly after Barbara and the children arrived to the U.S. The 10-year-old Johann in this example is John Buffy of Selkirk. Caroline is Caroline Kurtz, mother of Wally and Paul Kurtz, whose pictures from Reichau I showed you a few minutes ago. Little Anna Maria, or Marichen, died as a small child in New Jersey. Well, like I said, 100 years after they arrived, the German residents of Galicia had already begun to voluntarily leave. The First World War and its aftermath hastened the Germans leaving Galicia, mainly for Germany, the US, or Canada. After World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up, and this officially spelled the end of Galicia, as the part of Galicia that included Reichau was returned to Poland. World War II was the last straw for the little German settlements of the former Galicia. Only 30,000 Galician Germans had remained by 1939, and beginning in 1940, the Nazis deported them back west. After the war, all of the German towns were renamed Polish or Ukrainian names. It's interesting for me to note that at least 3 Buffy families that I am in contact with had parents that had to endure this period of forced migration. Times are obviously better now, and thanks to the internet we have become reunited with many of our kin in Germany and across North America, and we have learned so much more about our distant past. And there you have it, a short history of the Buffy family. Now, whether you are Canadian or American or German, whether you spell the last name with an I, an IE, or a Y, you can see how migration has shaped who we are since the beginning of time. We are a family whose ancestors some 400 years ago were most likely living in northern Italy or Switzerland, and who blessed us with an Italian last name that means funny, or possibly toad. Our ancestors migrated to lands that are on the modern French-German border, where they lived for a couple hundred years in the tiny German town of Schweinschied. Then our ancestors migrated to what is now Poland, where they lived for another 100 years. And then, in the case of you all here, on to North America, where we have been for the last 100 years. Let us preserve our present history together, so that 100 years from now, our descendants will thank us, and thank you for spending a little time this evening learning about your family. Good night.